There is a theory, by the way, that this was done to humiliate Marco Rubio and basically, make
Yeah,
him
but
look.
he's so used to humiliation, I don't think he even notices it anymore. Welcome, everyone. I am delighted today to be talking with my friend and colleague, Cathy Young of the Bulwark. Right in the very first week, it seemed, of the Trump second presidency, there was a terrible plane crash in the DC area that killed scores of people. And before they had even had a chance to pull the victims from the icy waters, far less perform any kind of investigation about what happened, Trump and his minions were out saying, well, this is DEI, obviously. It's the DEI policies of the Biden administration that have caused this accident. So Cathy and I both rolled our eyes and
Right,
pulled our hair out because obviously there's no way anybody could have known
right.
at that stage what caused the accident. But in other forums, I have said that I am somewhat in sympathy with the idea that DEI needs to be rolled back. And people in our chat and online have responded shocked. They think that means that I'm either on Trump's side or that I don't believe in outreach to minority communities or, the old-fashioned idea of diversity. And so I thought the perfect person to talk with me about this, to clarify the many layers of this and it is a very, very complicated topic. The topic of DEI, Cathy, you have written about it, I think, in a really great way, because you
Thank you.
say on the one hand, the Trump approach is atrocious and it almost
Right.
discredits the ideas that are out that really deserve a hearing because
Oh,
he's
yeah.
touching them.
Yeah. Well,
But
it's the everything that Trump touches dies
exactly,
principle, right?
exactly, exactly. But so first, let's start with your reaction to I'm sure it was the same as mine, it must have been DEI that caused the plane crash, right? I
Oh,
mean,
right, right.
um,
Uh, yeah, well, I think my reaction to this, I think, was a little worse than eye-rolling because it's not just ridiculous, it's also incredibly ghoulish because they started trying to dig up information that would confirm, like at first they put out word that supposedly the pilot of the Black Hawk helicopter was a transgender woman, which turned out to
mhm,
be inaccurate. I
false.
think
Yeah.
they got the name of the wrong person out. And then they zeroed in on this other woman who was part of the helicopter crew. We don't know whether she was piloting or not, who is female, may have been a lesbian. Oh my God,
Yeah.
and then of course it's just incredibly ghoulish that they
Yeah.
started saying, oh, look, her family has erased her social media posts. What are they hiding? Well, maybe they're hiding from ghouls like you who are going to be going through this dead woman's social media posts with a fine-tooth comb, trying to find something that could be pinned on her. But
100%.
I was, in a sense, I was really not surprised because this label of DEI has been going around for a while. And I think, I've written about this. I think there's a legitimate critique of DEI programs, both in the sense of preferential hiring, which does happen, and it's not new, by the way. It's been going on for
No,
a
it's been
while.
going on for decades,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, and I think it can backfire. People who are in the field, women and minorities who are in the field, have said that it sometimes backfires. There was years ago, you may remember, there was a great book by a Black law professor named Stephen Carter, who wrote a
Mm-hmm.
book called Reflections of an Affirmative Action Baby, talking about how this really was a double-edged sword because, there was preferential treatment of minorities and admissions to law school, and I think he did feel that it compromised his accomplishments somewhat. So
Right.
I
And,
think, that is
let
an
me just
ongoing
interrupt
debate.
real quick.
Yeah,
Let me just interrupt to mention that on one of Sarah's focus groups, just during this election year, there were African American voters who chose Trump. And one of them, it's more than one, mentioned that they do not want to be treated differently based on race, that they hate
right.
the blowback that they get where people assume that they must not have been fully qualified or that they got a leg up because of their skin color and that they don't, that is the inevitable downside of doing racial preferences. Now, it may be worth doing anyway, but you cannot deny that when you have a system of racial
Right.
preferences, there's going to be a stigma that attaches to the people you're trying to help.
Yeah. And, African American voters in California, for instance, voted for by a lesser margin than whites and Asians, but did vote in favor of a proposition that basically abolished racial preferences in public institutions. So I think, yeah, I think that we really should avoid the trap of, just because Trump is on this side of an issue, we have to be on the other side. I mean,
Right.
If Trump says you should help old ladies cross the street,
Yeah.
when it's icy out there, that doesn't mean that you should say, no, 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 you absolutely
Yeah.
shouldn't. So, yeah, I think that defining ourselves by opposition to everything Trump supports and vice versa is really allowing yourself to be defined by Trump in a way. We don't have to define ourselves in either support or opposition. So, I think that, uh, but the other thing that I want to add, I think when people have talked about DEI, and I think by the way, it's fairly new, I believe, to use the term DEI
Well,
in reference to preferential hiring.
that's what I was going to get to. Yeah.
Ah, okay.
There's a
Well, we're on the
difference. Yeah.
same
So
wavelength.
for decades, since the 1960s, um, academic institutions, public entities, businesses, and lots of areas of American life engaged in what was called affirmative action. And affirmative action was, people debated it. Some people said, well, it's really just racial quotas, people who opposed it. Those who were for it said, no, it's making affirmative efforts to go out and find qualified people in places and from communities who had been neglected and you wouldn't have necessarily found before. Okay. That went on for decades, and there were several big Supreme Court cases about it. There was the Bakke case in the 1970s. There was Fisher versus University of Michigan.
Right.
There were a bunch of big sort of landmark cases where the Supreme Court kind of stepped away from quotas to the point where last session, the Supreme Court outlawed them altogether.
Right.
And that is the tale of affirmative action. But DEI is a new thing that has come along in the recent past and got a boost of oxygen after the murder of George Floyd. And DEI is different. It is a whole ideology of white
Right.
supremacy and of
Right.
denying that you can even be race neutral, that everything has to be racial. So I'll give you an example. This is from Yasha Mounk's book. And this was, according to official guidance UCLA offered to its students, they should always treat their classmates as, quote, racial cultural beings. A failure to do so would be a microaggression. And there was a concerted attempt in some of these DEI teaching materials and so forth to elevate race and sex and gender and those qualities and all of those identity categories and make that a part of both, the student's experience and also in the workplace. So I'd love to hear your views on that.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's what I've primarily associated DEI with, is these programs and workshops in the workplace and in many institutions, corporate and government. And by the way, yeah, I should also mention that it's not entirely new either. It used to be called diversity training. And I
That's
remember
true.
reading there were controversies about some of these workshops going back like to the 1990s. I remember that there was a controversy about a guy named Edwin Nichols, who was a consultant who got paid exorbitant amount. Well, not exorbitant, but something like, $50,000 to do these workshops at the EPA, where he was saying things like, Black people are inherently warmer and more, kinder and so on. And, white people are these ice cold, rational beings that, try to approach the world with no emotions. And, and it was just incredibly polarizing. I think he also claimed that women in Africa actually have more equal rights than they do in the West, and that sort of thing. So there have been these controversial things going on again for years, but I think in the wake of George Floyd, when there really was the sense that we have to have this sort of revolution in racial equity, so to speak, there were some very, I think, ill-conceived efforts that really did give grist to this notion that it's all about blaming and shaming white people. And I will give you one example that I think is especially egregious, where in government agencies in Seattle, which obviously is not a typical place, but even so, they did these training sessions with titles like Interrupting Whiteness. And one of them involved an exercise that was basically telling white people to ponder, think of one way in which in the last like 2 or 3 months, you have caused harm to a coworker of color. So it's like literally telling people to do this soul-searching, and it's not really, because people I've gotten responses like, oh well, you just don't want to be forced to think about your privilege or something.
Your privilege.
Well, let me tell you, if there was a similar exercise where men were told, okay, ponder ways in which you have hurt women in the workplace in the past 2 months, I would be out of there so quickly, because I just think, not only I think is it incredibly unfair to men, but I find it really degrading to me. I think it's patronizing. I think it's ridiculous. I think it's polarizing.
Let's pause on that for a
Yeah.
second, because there's a lot of data out there, studies showing that these diversity training workshops, these DEI workshops, do the exact opposite of what they're hoping they'll do. It of course, it generates resentment, backlash, less feelings of unity and camaraderie in workplaces.
Right.
And wow, who can be shocked that if you're, if half or whatever percentage of your workforce is going into these programs and being told that they have to, re-examine themselves and look for the ways in which they have let their colleagues down,
right.
It's going to engender bad feelings.
Right. And there have been other things. I could give examples. I really don't want to run down a long list, but it's things like, think about the books that you have read in the past year. How many of them have been by writers of color? I think that's just, I mean, people read books for all sorts of reasons. I mean, maybe your hobby is like, 18th century French literature, and you're not going to read too many books by writers of color. So, yeah, it's
Yeah.
just,
And there were requirements for people looking for faculty positions in universities to make declarations about how their teaching would improve diversity, equity, and inclusion. And sometimes equity, I mean, and the universities are backing away from that because, that's kind of enforced speech. And of
yeah,
course, people
yeah,
aren't
and
going
I
to
think
be sincere.
they've had both students and faculty doing these sort of pledges to combat racism that are really based on the premise that everything in American society is permeated by racism. And obviously, no one denies. I mean, no sane person
No
of goodwill
reasonable person.
denies that we really do have a terrible history
Of
of
course.
racism, and it's not in the ancient past.
Correct.
A lot of it is fairly recent, um,
And a lot of
and
it exists today.
yeah, of course, and
Yeah.
and nobody says that, oh, we have to look away from that. There have been some ridiculous examples of overreaction that I'm sure you've heard about, like the school board. I can't remember now where it was, but they demanded that the book about the kids' book
Ruby
about Ruby
Bridges.
Bridges
Yeah.
be taken off the curriculum because it mentions an angry mob of white people. I mean, there
Yeah, I
really
know.
was an angry
People are
mob of white
such, I
people,
know, people are
that,
such
and they
idiots.
felt
I
that,
know.
oh, that makes little white kids feel bad about themselves.
Right.
Well,
That's history.
that's also ridiculous. And
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that this mindset that goes into some of these trainings, first of all, often relies on inaccurate information. Like a lot of the studies that are being bandied about have been debunked. Like there was one that you may remember about um, black infants supposedly having a higher mortality rate when they're cared for by white doctors. That turned out to be just mistaken because apparently there were some correlations that they didn't take into account. And
Oh,
when they did,
can I mention, because I do remember that survey, and here's what it was. It turned out that they were not taking into account that some of the sickest babies wind up in the care of specialists
right,
who tended to be more white
yeah,
than
yeah,
black. And therefore, when those babies died and you looked at just the race of the baby and the race of the
right.
doctor, you got a skewed result.
Right, right. So yeah, so I think we really have to be very careful when looking at that data. And there's some interesting information that I've seen in my research that really does suggest that these trainings can have really bad results. Like one thing that was really interesting, and you would have thought that progressives would tend to notice this sort of thing. They did a study that showed that when you give white liberals, I don't know if you've heard about this one, you have white liberals read a text about white privilege,
Hmm.
and then you give them another text that depicts a fictional white person of a really disadvantaged background, like the born into a single mother who's a drug addict and raised in poverty and so on. And then they gave these people questions like, how much help do you think this person deserves? And on a scale of 1 to 10, to what extent do you think this person is to blame for his condition? And they found that white liberals, after reading a text on white privilege, were far less sympathetic to this hypothetical white person who was from a severely disadvantaged background compared to, people who read a neutral text. So
Mm-hmm.
that's, I think that's really interesting. And it really does make you think about, is this really social justice that is being promoted here? There have also been studies showing that, about these implicit bias tests, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
people,
Mm-hmm.
they have people do a test that supposedly measures their biases, and they do it by it's sort of like very rapid associations with words, and do you see them as negative or positive? And supposedly these tests capture unconscious bias. And it's, and then the effect is that people are given these results and they're being told, like, ooh, look, you think that you're a nice, non-racist, liberal or moderate American who doesn't see color, but look, in fact, you are actually racist. And these hidden racial prejudices are affecting the way that you treat, people of color. And there have been several studies showing that these tests are, first of all, these tests are completely useless. They do not correlate with actual behavior. Secondly, they do not have a positive effect and may even have a negative effect on, human relations in the workplace. So I think there's a lot of evidence that, these DEI programs may be harmful. And I don't want to go on too long, but I want to give you another example from real life that I think is interesting. Because it promotes this idea, and this is, by the way, we've probably, most people have at least heard of Robin DiAngelo, the woman who does these workshops sort of based on the idea that everything that is done in our society is racist in one way or another. The only question is, in what way is it racist? And it essentially tells white people that everything they do, is potentially racist. Like, if you've interrupted a black person during a meeting, it has to be because that person is black, and so on. Like, if you comment on a black person's hair, and not in the sort of stereotypical, ooh, I love your curly hair, sense. But if you just tell them that, oh, your hair looks really beautiful today, you calling attention to a black woman's hair, absolutely racist.
Microaggression.
So yeah, and I think there has been a tendency in some, government institutions and some of these, corporations that really want to have a progressive cachet. There has been a tendency to kind of penalize people for fairly innocuous behavior. I read a fascinating example of this was a woman who I think was wrote a letter to some, advice column asking, what she should do and whether, what the best course of action was, whether she was wrong. So she was in a cafeteria, and a coworker who was from Samoa came in, and she was, very well dressed and just, looked very stylish that day. And this woman was sitting there with another female coworker. And when this woman approached the table, she said, "Oh, look, here comes Miss Samoa." She intended it as a compliment, obviously. It was well known that this woman from Samoa, and it was just, oh, she looks really stylish and beautiful today. So this other woman took offense and didn't say to her that she was offended, but instead went to HR, Human Relations,
HR.
and made a complaint of racial harassment. This woman was suspended. And not only that, but the insidious thing is she basically said to the HR person, look, I can talk to her and apologize. And I can tell her that, I didn't mean any harm, but I understand that it could have been, it could be seen as insensitive, and I won't do it again. And the HR person said, no. While you're under investigation, you are not allowed to speak to the complaining person. So they treated it as this racial harassment case where her talking to the complainer could be seen as intimidation. And it was fascinating because the response, and I think it may have been the New York Times ethicist column, which is always very, very politically correct. But, and this woman basically said, look, I've always been extremely anti-racism, but I really feel like I'm being treated unfairly here. And she got berated in the response and accused of quote unquote white fragility. Which is
Mm.
this term which, which means that supposedly like white people, because they're rarely confronted with the reality of racism, they experience extreme stress and distress when it's suggested to them that they may be racist. And well, maybe you're distressed because you're accused of. And I mean, look, the reality is that for some time now, racism has been, despite the fact that it continues to be a reality in sort of mainstream circles, racist has been regarded as one of the worst thing you can be, right? I mean, possibly, next to child molester, like the worst thing
Right,
you could
right,
possibly
right.
be is a racist. So,
So yeah, that is true, and arguably, although I do think there's been an uptick in overt racism since Trump became
oh,
a
absolutely.
public figure.
I've
Yeah,
seen
it's
it.
it's definitely come out from under the rocks where it was relegated.
Yeah, and look at people
And
defending that guy who works for Doge, this
yeah, yeah,
staffer who
yeah,
was posting really disgusting racist stuff,
absolutely. All for
and the
anti-Indian hate,
and the
normalize
defense.
hate.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Well, hang
yeah,
on, hang on. Let me
yeah.
just
Sorry.
make another point though, which is I want to talk with you about another aspect of this. Two more aspects. One is that in some of these, and then we're going to get to the Trump side of this and
Oh
the
yeah,
anti-woke thing. We'll get to that. But first,
absolutely.
let's focus a little for
The
a few more
anti-woke
minutes.
mind virus.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
It's
But
real.
some of these lessons and teachings of DEI types are insulting to minorities. I mean,
Oh,
they
absolutely.
attribute things to, they say things like perfectionism,
Is a part of
things
white
like
supremacy
being
culture.
on time,
Right.
things like, promptness. These are features of white supremacy culture.
Yeah.
And it is so it is.
Yeah, my favorite is a sense of urgency, by the way, which
Yeah,
is which is especially ironic because on that same side, we see a lot of claims that there is such urgency, in doing away with white supremacy in our culture that we really cannot pay too much attention to, details and, whether or not some individual is being kind of taken
right.
for a ride.
And
So yeah, it's ironic.
there's one more aspect of this that I'd love to hear your opinion on, and that is, and this is a point that's been made by I think it was John McWhorter, it might have been Matt Iglesias, but that this framing of black versus white is really outdated in today's America. We have so many millions of Americans who are multiracial now, and we have a huge population of Hispanics and Asians, and a lot of times these programs that are racial preferences are harmful to other minority
Mhm.
groups, so that it isn't a matter of black versus white. That's an outdated way of looking at it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I think I've mentioned it too. And it's interesting that, for instance, if you look at, there was a couple of years ago, there was this program that was being used at some major corporations, including AT&T, that was publicized. And I should say that it was publicized by Chris Rufa, who I think is an absolute hack. But
Yeah,
he
yes,
has actually dug up. I think these whistleblowers send him, materials from these programs. And
yeah,
the thing that I found fascinating is that it was a 21-day program for
yeah,
workshops, and of all the materials, like there were dozens of readings, and the overwhelming majority of them were about African Americans. And there were like, maybe of the dozens of texts, I think there were maybe like four about Hispanics and two about Asian Americans. And that's a real problem because that is a very outdated view of race relations, and it also completely, by the way, underrates the reality of mixed families because there's certainly a lot more intermarriage. It's really
Tons.
wrong to assume that somebody who is white necessarily has no Black, Hispanic, or Asian family members. This is a lot of this is very outdated. And by the way,
Absolutely.
some of these programs have also sort of toyed with these really toxic, I think, ideas that, oh, interracial marriage is kind of a little suspect because you have these power differentials, because the white spouse is in a position of privilege relative to the non-white spouse.
Let's say a word about Jews, because in a lot
Oh,
of
right,
these framings, these, the DEI administrators, and they are legion at universities,
right.
have put people into categories of oppressor or oppressed.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And they've put Jews into the white oppressors
Right,
category
right.
on many occasions. And this sort of has sown the seeds of anti-Semitism, which
Yeah.
are which really shockingly came to the fore after October 7th, where
Oh,
a
yeah.
lot of people on the left said that the Israelis had it coming,
Yeah.
and that this is what anti-colonialism looks like,
Yeah, and
and
there's
so on.
also this very facile equation of the Palestinians with blacks in America
Exactly.
under Jim Crow, which is, very, very
Exactly.
wrongheaded for many reasons.
And so, for I think you're Jewish, I'm Jewish.
Right.
The idea of being categorized in these, first of all, the idea of putting kids into racial classifications
Oh,
ever
yeah,
in
yeah.
school is horrifying to me. Nobody should send their kids to kindergarten and have them be put into affinity groups by
Right.
race or anything else. Um, and but they're doing that, and they're telling Jewish kids that they are white oppressors, and that is
Yeah, I
very
remember, by the way,
distressing.
yeah, there was an incident several years ago when there was in New York, where this very sort of woke, as we would say nowadays, official came in. I forget what the exact position was, but anyway, they started doing these trainings for teachers. And at one point, a Jewish teacher spoke up and said something about how, well, I feel very strongly about bigotry and, the importance of eradicating bigotry because my parents were Holocaust survivors. And then she got chided. She got, lectured and admonished for equating her parents and her experience with that of minorities in America. And she was basically told, like, no, 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 Jews are part of the,
White power
part of the
structure.
system of white privilege, and you really
Yeah,
cannot, put this in the same category. And I think she actually filed a complaint because she said that she just felt incredibly humiliated, and
yeah.
and rightly so. So I think, and I do want to offer a little caveat because I think when we talk about these things, it's important not to generalize too much from individual incidents.
Hmm.
And it's a little similar too, because I think a lot of the time on the progressive left, individual incidents of racism sometimes do, I think, tend to get, or alleged racism, but tend to get blown up into these, great dramas of oppression. And I think in the same way, it's important not to take individual reports of trainings that go really bad where somebody gets shamed and somebody gets driven to tears and so on and then accused of manipulating white tears to get sympathy. These things have happened, but I think we don't really know, and I think it would be, by the way, very helpful to do an actual objective study because for instance, one thing I've noticed about Rufo's reports about these workshops, a lot of the time he doesn't even know, he doesn't have any evidence that these training materials were ever used, you know. And I remember that in one instance, it was like, the corporation told me that this is very rarely used and that, it's not mandatory for anyone. But on the other hand, a whistleblower said that it's necessary for anyone
Yeah.
who wants to get a promotion. So who
Well,
knows? I
Rufo
mean, I
is a
think
bad faith actor.
absolutely.
Completely. So
So we don't have reliable information, I think, on
well,
how.
we do though. We have it from lots of other places
Yeah, that's true.
besides him.
Yeah,
We hear
that's true.
about all these trainings from lots and
Oh,
lots
sure.
of
Yeah, yeah.
people.
No, they are real.
Um, and
But,
and and I would recommend that people consult FIRE, the
oh,
Foundation for
fire is
Individual
great.
Rights and
Yeah,
Expression.
fire.
They have long lists of
Absolutely.
these
Yeah.
kinds of things, and they are completely fair to both sides.
People may want to look this up. Back in October, so before the election, it's not part of the post-election vibe shift or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
The New York Times ran a long, exhaustively researched and really good piece about diversity, equity, and inclusion programs at the University of Michigan, and
Yes.
how they actually did contribute to a lot of problems and cause a lot of
Yes.
bitterness, polarization, and
Yes.
were not helpful to their intended beneficiaries. So I think it's very
Yeah.
real.
Yeah.
And there has been, by the way,
100%.
something of a rollback already, like over the year preceding the election. A lot of corporations started backing away from some of these really divisive programs, and I think they have tried programs of a
Well,
different
can we
kind.
let's be real about why the corporations put these programs into
Oh, of
being.
course, of
They
course.
were trying to avoid lawsuits, and they were trying to just be on the right side of
Oh,
what seemed
sure.
like a big movement for
Sure, but it's damned if you do, damned if you don't, because then
that's
they
true.
get complaints from,
That is
people,
true.
from white
That is
people
true.
who said that they were browbeaten.
So, we're glad. Speaking for myself, I'm glad to see that there's a retreat from some of the DEI
Me too.
programs that were put into being a few short years ago. Though, of course, it's still a good thing when, like, the military goes to historically Black colleges to recruit and
Oh,
things
sure.
like
Yeah.
that. I
Yeah.
mean, all of that is great. But it's this kind of ideological, training that we've been
Sure.
describing
Absolutely.
that's
Yeah, and
so
look, I think that
offensive.
in some areas, I think a certain degree of, again, outreach to ensure a more balanced workforce is not only good but necessary. I mean, I think, for instance,
Absolutely.
if you talk about police officers, especially, you really don't want to have, an all white or, predominantly white, police force in Black neighborhoods, because
Or
there
Hispanic
is a history
neighborhoods.
there and it causes tensions. And I think it is important to have a balanced workforce. So, yeah, I think, we can all agree with that.
Absolutely. And actually, I think in pretty much every workplace, it's a good idea to
Yeah.
have, different, not just people with different skin colors and life experiences, but people with different points of view.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That is one thing that those who preach DEI tend to neglect is that,
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
viewpoint diversity is important too.
There was an incident. I don't know if you remember this. This was a few years ago where a Black executive at Apple, I think, who was a diversity chief, got fired from that position because she made a comment to the effect that, diversity isn't just about gender and skin color. You could have 10 people of the same gender and skin color in a room and still have a lot of diversity if they have different points of view and life experiences. And if you have, people of a mix of, ethnic and gender identities, but they all have the same point of view, that's not real diversity. So, and she got fired because apparently that was not acceptable, kind of
That's not what,
illustrating her point, really. So,
yeah.
So yeah, there's we don't want to defend the illiberal and polarizing and intolerant stuff that was going on in the name of diversity. I think that's again, it would be very myopic, I think, to say that, oh well, just because Trump and all these icky Trump people, many of whom really are icky,
They really are. So
on
you had
the other
a
side.
great expression in one of your pieces where you were writing about the Ron DeSantis Stop Woke Act, and you said the title of that legislation itself should be dragged out and shot or something like that. I mean, it was just So let's talk for a bit about the react. In a better world, people would see the excesses of DEI and say, of course we want affirmative action. Of course we want diversity. We just don't want the excesses that we've seen. We want to scale it back a little bit. We don't want to subject people to workshops that only increase intergroup tension. But that's not what we're seeing.
No,
from the right.
Of course not.
They are coming in with a sledgehammer, and actually they are inviting racists and bigots into their coalition. So talk about that.
Yeah, well, I think, and it's interesting that the second Trump administration has been so much more kind of overt and militant about this than the first one. And of course, the one example that I wrote about recently, this guy named Darren Beatty, who was fired from the first Trump administration, and I forget what his position was, but it wasn't even like a very high or noticeable position. But he got fired after it turned out that he had spoken at a conference that, while not overtly white nationalist, really was kind of, teeming with white nationalists and was associated with groups that are in that category. And he was asked to resign, and then he was fired. And since then, he has left a long social media trail and it's funny because his initial reaction was to say, oh, well, I just spoke at this conference, but I'm totally, totally not a racist. Yeah. And then he has these posts on Twitter or X, whatever we're supposed to call it now, that say things like, you need competent white men to run anything properly, but the problem is that our national ideology, and I'm maybe slightly misquoting here, is based on catering to the feelings of women and minorities, so nothing ever gets done. It's stuff like that, and it's he has a long trail of these things. He's praised China because the Chinese, unlike us, are not intimidated by the specter of racism. He's praised China because you're allowed to criticize feminism and have blackface shows. So this is a guy who he has basically said, and there's just so much. He has basically said that there's no reason we should defend Taiwan, because if they get taken over by China, the only thing that will happen is maybe they won't have quite as many drag shows, but otherwise it's fine. So he's especially obsessed, I think, with drag shows, and
a lot of these guys
this guy who was fired again from a position, and this was, by the way, when he was fired the first time, he was not nearly as overt about racism as he is now. He really did give a talk that was not ostensibly on a racial subject at a conference where he rubbed elbows with, white nationalists. So now, about 10 days ago, we suddenly learned that this guy is given a job at the State Department, and not just any job, but as basically the head of public diplomacy and public relations. It's insane. It's completely insane. Yeah. And now apparently that was an interim position, and he is now out. But I think the mere fact that they brought him in and they kept him there, despite because there was a pretty furious reaction for very good reasons, with people pointing out that this guy not only is he really pretty much an overt racist, but he sympathizes with China, and there is a theory, by the way, that this was done to humiliate Marco Rubio and basically, make him
Yeah, but
learn his
he's so
point.
used to humiliation, I don't think he
Yeah,
even
I
notices
guess.
it
What's
anymore.
one more, right?
Yeah.
So that I think is a bad sign. And and I should also mention, I don't want to dwell too much on Darren Beatty, but there was also among his many tweets on January 6th, he sent out several tweets that basically told various Black people, including Black conservatives like Tim Scott and
Oh, yes.
yeah, do you remember that? Tim Scott and oh my God, Kay Cole James. I'm
James, yeah, who was the
suddenly
head of the
blanking out.
Heritage
Yeah,
Foundation at the time.
the president of the Heritage Foundation, saying that they should learn their place and take a knee to MAGA. And this was done. He made several of these tweets. All of them were only about Black people. There was also one about Muriel Bowser, the mayor of DC. So yeah, I mean, to say this guy, he's basically
It's
doing anything but walk around in a KKK hat.
That's it. Right. That's right.
So
That's right.
he couldn't possibly be more overt about it. And this guy gets a public position. And then, of course, there was the other incident recently with what's his name, Marco Ellis, the guy who was
Oh, yeah, no, that's not his name. I forget his name.
yeah.
Yeah.
The
The
25-year-old
Musk guy, the Musk kid.
yeah, the 25-year-old guy from SpaceX, I think, who
Yeah, yeah,
got a
yeah.
job at Doge, and he's the one looking through materials that may include people's private information, and again, it turned out that he had tweeted things like normalize Indian hate. I was a racist before it was cool to be a racist.
Yeah.
And initially he was fired. And then, as you know, there was a groundswell from within the Trump
MAGA.
camp of, bring him back. J.D. Vance, who, of course, has an Indian wife and, children who are of part Indian background, said, I think we should forgive his mistake. And of course, I really want to know, like, if this had been the Biden administration or if it was the Harris campaign, and it turned out that a 25-year-old Harris campaign staffer had tweeted, only recently, like 4 months ago,
Right.
things like, I think it's perfectly fine to hate white people. I don't know. I don't think J.D. Vance would be out there saying, let's have grace and forgiveness and, let's not, rake people over the coals because of a mistake that they made in their youth, which is like 4 months ago when they're 25. So yeah,
And so what's really sad about
It
this, I mean, among many other things, but what's so maddening is that, first of all, that this is even normalized, that,
course.
we in 2025, that, but the other thing is that it completely discredits any criticism
Of course.
of the excesses of the left, because if you mention, as we have in the first part of this podcast, some of the excesses that the left has done on DEI, and then you say, and here's the other side,
Yeah, and it's just mutual cycle. Yeah, and
well, it's not even just a cycle. This is worse. Okay,
Yeah,
what the Trump people are doing is vicious, old-fashioned bigotry and racism,
absolutely.
which is, in my opinion, worse than
I agree,
the
yes.
thing that they are trying to,
I agree.
that they are reacting to.
Yeah, and of course, the thing that is also really kind of aggravating is that this argument gets made, and I've seen, like, I spent about 2 days, and it was probably a waste of time, but I really spent way too much time arguing with people on X about this Doge guy, the racist Doge guy.
Yeah.
And it was, the arguments I was seeing were basically stuff like, well, look, like, people on the other side spent 4 years making it perfectly fine to, abuse and shame and, and so on, and demonize white people. And of course, it's this incredibly exaggerated picture of reality, by the way, where you would think, looking at some of what they're saying, that, the Biden administration, all but put out an official proclamation saying, we hereby
Open
declare that
season.
all white people are evil, And but the argument is that, well, we now it's our turn, and
Yeah.
we can be, well, where does that get you? Even if it's true, like, even allowing for a moment that that's true, it's
Which it
just really
isn't,
going
but
to
yeah.
be this never-ending cycle of backlashes, which is going to get uglier every time, and it's a really, really disturbing mentality, not only because it's so divorced from fact, and it's this and it's also kind of ironic because they're talking about, well, we have spent 4 years or 10 years or whatever dealing with with this racial grievance industry, which has shamed and demonized white people. And of course, they're talking about racial grievance, and they are peddling this incredibly intense and toxic racial grievance, this white racial grievance, where
Exactly.
it's this
Yeah.
completely exaggerated sense of victimhood. And you'd think that, like, every white person has spent the entire 4 years of the Biden administration, cowering in fear, which, honestly, they did not. So it's just,
Yeah. I mean, so having watched this, I mean, in my own lifetime, I have seen so much of a change in this country. And for the longest time, it was all in a positive direction. Like
yeah,
the racism, the open racism that was part of this country in the 60s and 70s began to diminish. Of course, where I was born in the Northeast and I grew up in liberal
right.
environments. And so it was particularly, right from the beginning, it was always considered, really shameful to be a racist.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
But I was an American. I was aware of what's going on in other places.
right.
And I watched it diminish. I looked at the statistics, like if you looked at things like attitudes, that can be a little confusing in terms of polling. But if you looked at
Yeah.
intermarriage, the
Mm-hmm.
rates of Black and white people marrying each other, the graph went like this,
Oh, yeah,
from
yeah,
the 1960s to the 2000s, and just in general, the society got so much less racist. And then we got into the sort of anti-racism, I think, sort of cul-de-sac with DEI and stuff that really was offensive and unhelpful. And then at the same time, we get this complete raw, ugly
yeah,
excrescence of pure old-fashioned racism coming from the right. This is one of the reasons I could never call myself a Republican again, because
right, right.
when I was coming up, I mean, the Republican Party believed in, supposedly they said they believed in
Yeah,
race blindness. They wanted to
yeah,
be
yeah.
colorblind, treat everyone as an individual, don't treat people as members of groups. And now that's all gone. And boy, is it a different world.
Yeah. And I will say, I think there's a really fine line between, on the one hand, blaming the left for the ugly behavior on the right, which,
I don't.
completely unacceptable, because you
No, I
never really
don't.
want to say, oh,
No,
well, you guys forced me to be a racist
no,
because you
100%
told me
no.
that white people are racist. No, that's completely unacceptable. On the
Agreed.
other hand, I will say, this is where I pull out the other hand. I
Yeah.
will say, and I wrote this like back in 2015. I checked one of my old articles from 10 years ago, where I kind of commented on this proliferation of sort of performative white bashing on the progressive left, where, and I think some people try to justify it and say, like, oh, well, when these activists say, white people suck, what they actually mean is that, we hate white supremacy. No, this is not a good idea. And
Yeah.
I did say that, it is really not a good idea to uh kind of undo the taboo, which we have quite rightly attached, over the past, I don't know, 30, 40 years, to expressions of racial hostility and to, insulting people based on their race. And I think, and I did say that, if you say, well, that doesn't apply to white people, pretty soon you are going to weaken that stigma in general. You're going to weaken the stigma against, racialized pejoratives. And I think that could backfire hugely, I said 10 years ago. And I think there's a fine line between, on the one hand, recognizing that and pointing out to the left that, some of its behavior has really been very counterproductive. But one should be able to do that without justifying the ugly and incredibly toxic behavior on the right, because it should never become, oh, look how you forced me to be a racist. No one forced you to be a racist. And
that is a great place to end it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Cathy. I really appreciate you
Thank
joining
you.
me.
It's been fun. We should do this again sometime.
All right.
So many
Terrific.
things to talk about.
Agreed. Take care.